I want to welcome everyone. My name is Kevin Morgan Watson. I am the publisher and editor-in-chief of Press 53 in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And it's my great pleasure today to introduce Robert Morgan, who has a new collection of short stories out titled In the Snowbird Mountains and Other Stories. When Robert contacted me a little over a year ago and said he had a new story collection and wanted to know if I would be interested in publishing it. I was very interested in publishing it, very interested to actually read these stories. I was so glad to see he was still writing short stories because he's been working on big books for a while. And the last one, well, we had Daniel Boone was out. I'm not sure if he had one after that. We'll find out later. But that was a big book, and it was a very popular book. And there was another one, Lions of the West, about the westward expansion. So when he said he had been writing short stories, I was very, very happy because as many of you know, I love short fiction and poetry. And to know that Robert was still writing short fiction was great news for me. So we're going to have Bob join us here, and I'm going to add him with me so y'all can see him. And then I'm going to turn it over to him in a minute. But I had a question for you, Bob. I just wanted, before you got started, in the Snowbird Mountains, most of these stories take place in North Carolina. And is the Snowbird Mountains an actual place in North Carolina? Oh, you'll have to unmute. Let me unmute you. Hang on a sec. You have to unmute yourself, Robert. Down the lower right, left corner. There we go.
Snowbird Mountains are an actual place, though that's not the name used anymore. I think they call that area the Nantahala National Forest now, but I used to hear that name when my dad and uncles went bear hunting and wild boar hunting over there. It's near the Joyce Kilburn National Forest, Graham County, North Carolina. So I like that name, the Snowbird Mountains and the Snowbird Mountains. So I used it, but you won't find it on a map. It's just, I think some of the old timers use that word. As to the question, all the stories set in North Carolina, it is my native state, and I probably know it better than any other state, but I think it's a subject, a place that found me, because my writing seems to go back there, and it's not as though I choose it, it chooses me.
You do have one story in here that traverses from eastern North Carolina down to Florida. How did that come about?
It is loosely based on a story I used to hear my grandpa tell about going down to Florida during the Depression to find work. And I guess he got in trouble. He had a wreck and was put in jail. But I was thinking about the 30s and just how hard it was that time, and about the young people hitchhiking around. And I thought, boy, what if they get hit by a hurricane? How would they survive? No place to go. They're out in the open. And I just let the sympathetic imagination take over and imagined what it would be like to be in Florida when a hurricane hits and you have nowhere to go except on the beach and then into the woods. And the woods are all knocked down. That's another definition of hurricane. All the woods are blasted and knocked over.
Yeah, it was almost like an atomic bomb went off. It was a harrowing story. So, but you have something you want to read for us today, which is the second part of a story that I learned a lot from, and did some research after reading that story to increase my knowledge on some of the interesting places in this state we call home. So I'm going to turn it over to you and let you share that with everyone here.
Okay.
Okay.
There really is a place called Judaculla Rock. It is a big boulder up in, I guess, Jackson County, North Carolina. And it has petroglyphs all over it. Very odd markings, look like octopuses and stick figures. Nobody knows how to interpret it. It apparently antedates the Cherokees. Some of the Cherokees claim it, and others claim it was there when the Cherokees arrived. I think the inspiration for the story came from reading in the newspaper that somebody had gone and chipped away in a place at the rock. There was some vandalism. So I began to imagine a story that would fit this series of stories. If you read the book, you will notice that 4 of the stories have the same plot, basically. A man who grew up in the mountains of North Carolina has gone off to college and is living in the center of the state in the Piedmont, but for various reasons, they go back to the mountains and they have different adventures. So I think of the book as theme and variations, and the variations are separated by interludes, different kinds of stories. The character in Judaculla Rock is Jim Evans, a retired professor of botany, and his specialty is ferns, though he's thinking about getting at the mushrooms in his retirement. He goes up to see this rock. He's heard about it, he knows about it, but he's also heard of the vandalism. And a report that somebody said these markings are microscopic animals, amoeba, rotifers, paramecia, that somebody could see with microscopic vision all those hundreds of thousands of years ago. Well, he knows that can't be true, but he goes up to see it. It's a very foggy day when he goes. He's looking at these markings, the petroglyphs, and a woman runs up and says, "You've got to help me. My father is dying of a heart attack. Come, come." And he follows her. And then he's hit on the head, is blacked out for a while. When he woke in cold, wet leaves, Jim saw the fog around thick as before. His thoughts, too, were in deep shadow and slow to focus. The back of his head throbbed. He was cold, and when he felt around, he found he was completely naked. Even his shoes were gone. His phone, wallet, car keys, all had been taken. He sat up under the rhododendron bushes and tried to think. Slowly, the events came back to him. The visit to Judaculla Rock, the girl in the fog, the story that her daddy was dying, the long walk through the woods. He had been taken in by the most obvious kind. The clues that the woman had been lying were obvious in retrospect, and he'd gone along like a moron. Jim's next thought that no one must ever know how he had been tricked. He must conceal his stupidity, his naivete. And slowly it began to sink in just what a mess he was in. His wallet was gone, his money, his credit cards, his identification, and maybe worst of all was he had no clothes. Even if he found his way out of the woods, what could he do? Flag down a car on the highway? Who would stop for a crazy man in his birthday suit, waving his arms? Vanity was the least of his problems. His best bet was to somehow get arrested, then explain things to the cops. But in the deep fog, how was he to find someone to arrest him? Jim realized it had been hard to follow the trail with the woman because there had been no trail. She had said there was a trail, and he believed her. She had led him deep into pathless woods, into a rhododendron thicket, what used to be called a laurel hell. He was lost. Jim pushed himself up and held on to a tree. Often in his life, he had contemplated what he'd do in such a desperate fix. Would he panic and act like a fool? Would he bravely and calmly assess the challenges and meet them? Would he prove to be a coward or a resourceful survivor? It would do no good to kick himself. Jim knew the mountains were now overrun with crime, crackheads, drug pushers, burglary rings, scam artists of all kinds. that studying the petroglyphs had seemed to be a rational and worthwhile venture. Think, he said to himself, until you have a plan, stay right where you are. He recalled a line he had read in a poem once, when lost in the woods, let the wilderness find you. But that seemed a little silly now, just the kind of paradoxical statement poets safe in their studies like to make. As he stood in the fog and the wet leaves, holding onto the sapling, it seemed the bottom had dropped out of the world. He had not felt such despair when he was a graduate student and was told his fellowship would not be renewed. He was naked and utterly alone and knew he had acted like a sucker. The fog was smothering. To distract himself in his youth, he had repeated the question that we most of the time avoid. What is the explanation of it all? What is the very essence? What is the logic of our lives and of the universe that we know? It can't be just endlessly reproducing ourselves. While pondering these happy verities, Jim clutched the sapling. The fog was getting thicker, if that was possible. He could hardly see the rhododendron leaves nearby. Was his vision failing? Had the strength of the blow to his head damaged the optic nerves? And then it came to him that the day was waning. It must be getting dark. He had no idea how long he had been unconscious. His watch had been taken. His glasses had been taken. In the fog, it seemed that time did not exist. Looking for moss on the north side. Look for moss on the north side, the Boy Scout manual used to say. He vaguely recalled the woman had led him in a northerly direction from the clearing around Judicola Rock. So if he could determine what was the way north, he should go in the opposite direction. But in the fog and dim light, Jim could see no moss on the saplings or on anything else. Touching the trunks around him, he felt nothing that seemed soft and padded like moss. It was at that moment that he panicked and did exactly what all folklore, all scout manuals, and the poet warned him not to do. He started running with his hands out in front to push away limbs. He stumbled over rocks and logs and picked himself up. Limbs slapped his face and twigs lashed his eyes and ears. His knees grew weak and he tripped and fell in the wet leaves, his shoulder thudding against a large tree trunk. Jim cried. He didn't have the willpower any longer to think deep, dark thoughts about the meaning of life or the lack of meaning. That was a luxury for the safe and spoiled. He was too weak and helpless to be ironic or cynical. He cried like a child lost from his mother, no longer able to laugh at himself or be sarcastic. He wept and sat, leaning against the tree, and eventually he became drowsy with exhaustion and slept. In his dreams, Jim imagined that his naked body was a stove, and he fueled his stove body with willpower and imagination. It was a matter of concentration. He burned his thoughts for fuel. In the dream, his mind turned back to the designs on Judicola Rock. It didn't matter who made the markings. The meaning was the same, whoever had done the carvings, and whenever they were scratched. The petroglyphs showed the clutter, the confusion, the ambiguities of human consciousness. They were a graffiti wall, a bathroom wall of fragments where many had left a mark, drawn a picture, told a story, come to leave a signature, a motto, a sign of belief or disbelief. The rock was a ledger of the perennial human aspiration to make sense of things, to leave a legacy, even if only a confession of uncertainty. For some ancient people, the rock was their internet, an archive, their social media, where they left messages for each other and for posterity. It was their history, the way the wampum belts were a record of the later tribes. Because the Cherokees didn't know how to read the pictures, they speculated that the slant-eyed giant Judicola had marked the soapstone as he leapt into the valley below. When Jim woke, it was still foggy. He'd not eaten or drunk anything since yesterday morning. Moisture gathered all around him, clinging to his skin, but he couldn't drink the fog. Luckily, it was summer, or he would have died of exposure in his nakedness at this high elevation. He was naked as Cabeza de Vaca when he returned to Mexico. He might have crawled on all fours and eat grass like Nebuchadnezzar, if he could have found any grass. If you walk downhill, you will come to a stream, to the headwaters of a stream, he told himself. If you come to a stream, you can drink. If you follow the stream, it will lead you to a larger stream, and that stream will lead you to a larger stream still, and to people. In his nakedness, Jim did not know how he would be received, but he knew he had to find others. Only other people could help him. He tried to discern which way the ground sloped. Feeling with his feet, holding onto trees and limbs, he descended, or imagined he descended through the woods. In the fog, Jim didn't see a spring, or even smell it, but felt the wetness with his feet. Wet leaves had accumulated in a catchment. Dropping to his knees, he pushed away leaves and sticks and muck and saw that indeed there was a little pool. He had made the water muddy, but there was a ripple of ebullition as the water emerged from an opening in the rocks. He had found a spring. He waited a few moments for the little basin to clear and cupped his hands and drank. What a difference a drink of cold, fresh water can make. Jim didn't know how thirsty he was until he gulped the spring water that had seeped through veins inside the mountain. For him, it was better than the elixir of the alchemist, or the fountain of youth Ponce de Leon, searched for in Florida. He splashed water on his face and on his shoulders and chest. He was covered with dirt, leaf bits, twigs, cobwebs, scratches. He was lucky he hadn't been bitten by a black widow spider or a copperhead. It was while washing himself in the cold spring water that he noticed a fern on the bank below the spring. In the fog, it was hard to guess at first what species it was. But as he looked closer, he saw it was a common rock cap, a fern that grows on top of rocks and feeds on decaying vegetable matter, related to the resurrection fern, but not epiphytic, Polypodium virginianum. The blades on the fronds look separate and symmetrical, but in fact are joined and alternating. In his dissertation, he devoted several pages to the rock cap and its range in the Piedmont and mountains. It prefers shady acid soil, but can thrive on boulders and cliffs if there's enough moisture. Spores are borne under the blades near the tips of the fronds. They grow best where there is little sun. As Jim searched farther, he found other ferns. Not a glade exactly, but a slightly more open space with royal and cinnamon ferns, rattlesnake and hay-scented ferns. Their lush fronds curved in the fog like giant feathers. He thought of monks and medieval scriptoria writing fancy letters in books of history and theology. The green fronds looked gray and silver in the mist. He thought he saw a rare Goldie's giant fern and stepped closer to get a better look. But it was not a fern that startled him. Two brown legs stood behind the Goldie's giant. Jim jerked back, then looked up at a small person in a white shirt. He couldn't tell at first if it was a boy or girl. Covered his crotch, remembering his shameful nakedness. Could this be one of those who robbed him and returned to kill the only witness to their crime? "Who are you?" Jim said. The person, tall as his chest, didn't answer. "I've been robbed," he said, "and they took all my clothes." The figure remained quiet. Jim looked closer to make sure there was really someone there. It occurred to him he might be hallucinating from hunger or from stress and fear. He was 67 years old. He'd never been so scared and lost. The person in the white shirt had a dark face and dark hair. "I can explain why I don't have any clothes," he said. Till the figure watched him without speaking. It was almost certainly a boy with black hair and black eyes watching Jim as though curious, as if he wondered whether Jim was a human or a ghost or some alien being or maybe a lunatic. "I won't hurt you," Jim said. "I just need to find my way out of here. Can you tell me who you are? Do you know how we can get to the nearest road?" Jim might as well have been speaking to one of the ferns. As mist swirled around his face, he felt dizzy, as if vertigo was coming on. The boy was still as a carved statue. His eyes did not move or blink. Jim thought he might be 11, 12. It was hard to tell. He tried to think who the boy might be. His skin was dark as a Mexican's. He knew there were thousands of Hispanics living in western North Carolina. Most worked in fields or in construction. Maybe this boy was a recent arrival who didn't understand English. Jim tried to think of some Spanish phrases. Per favor, he said. Still the boy didn't speak. There was something about his face that didn't seem Mexican. He was thin and angular. His silence unnerved Jim, this staring at his nakedness. He'd never felt so ashamed, for he had brought all this ludicrous misery on himself. Guilt and helplessness overwhelmed him, and a sob choked his throat and he heaved his chest. Jim wept without meaning to, wiped his nose and eyes with the back of his hand. Jim had a PhD, was a scientist, a professor emeritus. He had a wife and children and grandchildren. He'd published books and many articles in peer-reviewed journals, and he belonged to a number of professional organizations and learned societies. He had a pension, but none of that could help him. The boy in the shorts and long white hair watched him, wiped his eyes, and said nothing. It occurred to Jim he might be a deaf mute. Then the boy turned away. He gestured for Jim to follow. Jim hesitated. Would he lead him into a trap? Did he work for the drug traffickers, the meth sellers? But what trap could be worse than the one Jim was already in? What choice did he have? The boy paused and looked back and gestured again, and this time Jim followed. The boy picked his way among ferns and boulders, then away from the stream, through the trees. As they walked, the fog seemed to thin a little. Jim realized he could see the boy clearly and farther into the woods ahead. The boy took his time, making sure Jim was able to tag along. His brown legs and sneakers made hardly a sound in the wet leaves. Jim stayed 5 or 6 feet behind him. As Jim walked, he decided the boy might be an Indian or Cherokee. The Qualla Reservation was only 25 or 30 miles to the north on the Oconaluftee River. But as they wound around trees and crossed logs, Jim thought of a story he'd heard growing up about a so-called will-o'-the-wisp, a spirit that came to someone lost or injured in the woods and led them to safety. The will-o'-the-wisp was usually described as a light that floated ahead of the lost person. But this boy was no will-o'-the-wisp. He didn't speak, but Jim was pretty sure he was no ghost. Jim heard a hawk whistle. Shafts of sunlight shot through the canopy above and through spotlights on the leaves. The air was getting warmer. They passed the ruins of what looked like an old moonshine still. Jim's uncles had made moonshine when he was a boy, and one, Uncle Harry, had served a year in the Atlanta penitentiary for selling blockade whiskey. Jim's feet were sore, but he didn't dare drop behind the silent boy serving as his scout and pilot. The word scout made something click in his head. He recalled that early explorers of the region, men such as Daniel Boone, found people who lived in the woods like Indians, but were not Indians. They were dark people with mostly Caucasian features, called Melungeons. Scholars over the years had studied them to learn their language and where they might have come from. In the early days, some had described them as the lost tribe of Israel. Others declared them to be Welsh people who had come to the New World before Columbus. Others said they might be descended from Sir Walter Raleigh's lost colony, who had wandered into the wilderness from the East Coast in the 1580s and intermarried with the Indians. But more recent scholars had determined that Melungeons were part Turkish and part Cherokee, with some African blood. The boy was leading him. He might be Melungeon, given his dark skin, his slim figure and features. Jim was pretty sure that's what he was. "Where are we going?" Jim called, but the boy kept walking and didn't answer. Jim was almost certain he could hear him. Once the boy looked back to confirm Jim was still following, and then resumed his pace. I'm grateful you're helping me, Jim said, but the boy didn't respond. The fog had cleared away, and blue sky was visible above the treetops. The sun was so bright it blinded him. Then he heard voices, not loud enough for him to distinguish words, human voices calling to each other. Wait, Jim called to the boy. He stopped and thought the boy must hear the voices too. Jim pointed. There's someone there. When he looked again, the boy was gone, vanished into the trees as quickly as if he had been beamed away in a sci-fi movie. Where are you? Jim called. The approaching voices grew louder, and when two hounds on leashes and a deputy sheriff in uniform and half a dozen other men broke through the underbrush, Jim cringed and covered his naked crotch, relieved and ashamed. I was robbed, he said to the deputy. Jim told him his name. We know, Dr. Evans, the deputy said. We've been looking for you. The deputy carried a pair of coveralls, the kind garage mechanics used to wear, and Jim put them on. The deputy had no shoes for Jim's sore feet, but he did have a bottle of water and several energy bars. And Jim munched the bars. The deputy told him his clothes had been found in his car, which had been driven south and abandoned in Georgia. Lisa had informed the police he was visiting Judicola Rock, and now she was on her way to Silva to look for him. The deputy said Jim could call her on his phone. The people who had mugged Jim had made dozens of purchases with his credit cards in North Carolina and Georgia, and they had not been caught yet. The deputy said he was sure they had targeted other visitors to Judicola Rock. A sign should be put up warning people not to go there alone. People kept going up there hoping to figure out those scratches, the deputy said, but I could tell them they don't mean a thing, just a bunch of doodles. Jim could see why the deputy would say that, but he knew the deputy was wrong. The card figures told a profound story about the need to tell a story to all who would care to look or listen. I'm awfully glad to see you folks, Jim said to the deputy and his companions. I'm grateful you came looking for me. You and this boy have saved my life. I don't see no boy, the deputy said. Jim turned around to look again for the boy in the white shirt, but the woods behind him were empty. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Robert. That was really nice. It's good to hear you read your stories. I remember years ago when we met, you said to me that short stories were like snakes. They strike quick and draw blood.
Did I say that?
Yeah, you did.
I like
Unless
that.
I'm making it up, but you're glad to take credit for it if you want to.
Mm-hmm.
But this one, even though there was nothing struck quick in this story to me, but it was a very patient story. You took your time to lay this out, even though he was in danger. You made him work for it.
Well, the short story, I think, is just about the hardest genre there is to write because it has to be as perfect as a poem or close to it, but it has to have character development and tension and build up. It also has to have surprise. A story with no surprise is, I guess, an anecdote. I used to tell my students that a good story can't be linear. It's got to be quadratic. It's got to curve. It's got to go where you don't expect. But when it goes there, it seems inevitable. It seems perfect. So you've got to do all that in a short space and make the reader feel satisfied at the end. They've covered some distance and they have come where they didn't expect to be, but it's the right place once you get there. One of my favorite quotes about the short story is from Hollis Summers. He said, the point of the story is always the point beside the point. I've never been able to beat that.
Right.
The point is there all the time. You just don't see it. It's a peripheral vision, or it's around a bend, and when you get there, you see you should have noticed the clues as you went along.
Right. And I found that in all these stories. And these stories surprised me in a way that they weren't the kind of stories I expected that you were going to send me. These are different stories. They're different from what you've written before. How did that come about?
Well, I hope I've grown a little bit, or at least, tried some new things. There was a period after I had brain surgery, and I had a lot of time on my hands, and was trying to get back into writing. And I guess the first one was the Devil's Courthouse,
Oh,
one of my favorite places on the Blue Ridge Parkway. This great cliff on a mountainside, and I think I'd read in the paper that they had found a skeleton somewhere in Pisgah Forest, and I began to think about the days they were mining gold in the mountains, a little further down the mountains, not that high, and create a story where somebody has an adventure. So I wanted each of these stories to have an adventure, something that you couldn't possibly predict, and where there was danger or something really unusual. But I realized I wanted to write similar stories like Theme and Variations. This going back to the mountains. When I go back, I always, get a little misty-eyed or catch in my throat as you come up Interstate 40 and you can see the Black Mountains and Mount Mitchell ahead, and it looks so cool and high, almost merging the mountains. So I use that motif in each story. Somebody's coming back to the mountains, their native mountains, but they have very different adventures. Obviously, Judiculla Rock, is a kind of a romantic thing, trying to figure out who wrote it, what it's about, what does it mean. There's so many different explanations for that. One, I think, was that it was something the Cherokees wrote to celebrate their great victory over the Muskogees, the Creeks, in 1755, when Nanya became, the last war woman of the Cherokees. Other theories are that it's a picture of the zodiac, some early group, probably earlier than the Cherokees. And it's so much fun to think of, those mountains, the same mountains with all these different people with different languages. Thousands of years have been there. Different stories, different holy men, different holy women, going way back. It's not as though people, came to unsettled place, the white people. It had been settled forever, for a long time.
yeah. You also touch on a bit of fantasy in here. There's a story, The Wonderful City, about a boy who has a fever, if I'm recalling it correctly. And the whole story reads like a fever dream, but it's so real and surreal. Where did that come from? And why did you include it with these other stories that were vastly different?
I wanted interludes between the other stories, something very different, set in the same place, actually. Part of the inspiration was the typhoid epidemic in the early 20s. I grew up hearing stories, particularly about my Uncle William, who almost died. So I called this character Billy. And but I wanted to write something that wasn't just realism, some variation. I think I'd been reading some stories by H.P. Lovecraft. He's a wonderful story writer, and fantastic things, surreal things. So how do you do that, in a believable context? So the fever dream is one solution. And of course, we were living in the pandemic and the lockdown. So you have a pandemic and a lockdown there, the typhoid epidemic. People had to stay at home. You couldn't go to church. You couldn't go to school. If you had typhoid in the house, there was a sign on your house saying it was quarantine back then. So that's the setting, and then he has these marvelous dreams. The wonderful city, just over the mountains, beyond Hendersonville, beyond Asheville, this incredible place. And since it's a fever dream, you can do anything you want. Just make it fantastic. Put it up in the sky or under the ground. And in that dream, he goes both places. He climbs up and up like Jack and the Beanstalk, and there's his horrible teacher who's giving him a spelling test, and It goes down, down, down below the wonderful city and has to come up through the sewer into this wonderful place. It's all light and windows and wonderful things happening.
It was a great read. It was a lot of fun. And you've also thrown a ghost story in there. The story you just read, you could think that's a ghost story, but it hints at that. But there's an actual ghost story in this collection, which I found not only interesting, but it was funny. There was a lot of humor in it, dark humor, but it was humor just the same. Where did that one come from?
I wrote that originally as a fairly short story, published in Appalachian Heritage, I think it was. I just love this situation. You have an architect. I admire architects. He also is from the Blue Ridge Mountains originally, but he lives in Raleigh, and he comes home one day and there's his ninth grade English teacher sitting in the living room while his family have gone down to Ocracoke for their vacation. He needs to join them, but there's his teacher who did him a great favor, and how is he going to get rid of her so he can head off to Ocracoke? He's got to make the deadline when the ferry leaves. And I just thought that was a lot of fun. I rewrote it as a play, expanded it a great deal and into a long one-act play. And it was never produced, but I thought, well, I can carve this down into a longer story, get in more characters. So he keeps encountering people that he's known in his life, and as it turns out, who helped him or saved his life one way or another. And had a lot of fun with that, imagining, who people he hardly remembers who actually saved him at some point, including a bank teller who spotted that somebody's embezzling all of his money. And had they done that, he wouldn't have had enough money to go to architecture school. The preacher with whom he was saved as a boy at the revival meeting, and lots of other. I got to quote Sartre's line about hell is other people, and play off of that at one point.
Yeah, it was a fun read for sure. I had a blast with it. I'm a fan of your poetry as well. In Press 53, we publish poetry and short fiction, which are the two things I love, and they don't get as much attention as they deserve. How do you compare writing short stories to writing poetry?
I think they're similar in many ways. They depend on narration, of course, and for me, they're cut from the same cloth. The subjects are often very similar. Poetry depends more on your sense of line, I think, and the space of the poem, the turning of the line, playing off of a metaphor and expanding it somewhat, and also coming to closure. It's a different kind of ronder. Short fiction, in some ways, is harder because you have nothing to go on but the voice, the narrative voice, and the creation of a fictive space, which you create word by word and sentence by sentence. One reason it's so hard to turn memory or real anecdotes into short stories is that you already know what happens, so you don't have that act of discovery. When you're making up a story, you create that world one sentence at a time, and you know what's relevant, whereas if you already know the story, you don't necessarily know what's relevant to get to the main point. But as I was saying earlier, the short story is a very hard genre because you've got to do so much with so little. It's mostly an implicit form, and you can't even get too much dialogue. When I write a scene with dialogue, I usually cut out 2/3 of it down to the absolute essential part of it. But there's nothing, I think, more exhilarating than finishing a short story where you know it's landed on its feet. You've come to the correct ending. And it's, of course, usually for me, bigger. It's longer than poems. I wouldn't rate one over the other, in terms of quality or excitement, but I do think the short story is harder, actually.
Yeah, well, you delivered some wonderful endings with these stories. I was satisfied with all of them. had a great time reading these stories over and over again during our back and forth on a couple of them and discussions we had. It was great fun for me. So thank you for thinking of Press 53 when you were looking for a home for these. I appreciate it more than you know. And
Thank you for publishing the book.
Oh, my pleasure.
It's a beautiful volume.
Yeah.
Great cover.
Anyway, thank you for reading today. I want to open this up for questions. We have a lot of people who are online listening, and I'm sure someone has a question for Bob. Just unmute yourself and ask away.
Can't have answered all the questions.
I think they're stunned.
Bob, I'll start off. You want to talk about the Melungeons in North Carolina, and there's some question whether this mysterious boy may be a Melungeon. You want to tell us a little about that, and how does he come into the story, and what do you think of him in the story?
Well, I only know what Jim knows about it. Melungeons have been a controversial group because for a long time nobody knew exactly where they might have come from. It turns out scholars now think they're partly Turkish because after the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, the Spanish captured so many Turkish soldiers, they didn't know what to do with them, so they took them down to the Gulf of Mexico and dumped them on the shore, and they wandered inland and intermarried with Indians and later with escaped African Americans. But they've been there a long time, and they're mostly gone. They've intermarried with other people, and there are very few people considered what would you call pure Melungeon now. But I remember people who belong to that. The most common name is Goins, and they did have dark skin, otherwise features that were Caucasian. They lived in the mountains, often involved in logging, working in timber. But I thought it'd be interesting if he's saved by a figure who possibly is supernatural. I don't answer that. He might be the will-o'-the-wisp or the lantern. Some people in the mountains said there were lanterns, the magic lanterns that would come and lead you to safety. Sometimes a hunter who was injured back in the woods. But I leave that for the reader to decide.
I think it's perfect that he's a kind of a person of unknown provenance who appears, and he's kind of the perfect savior in this story.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Now, I thought the white shirt was a nice touch.
Right, it's bright there in the woods. He's in the gloom of the woods looking at mushrooms, and suddenly this figure wearing the white shirt, suggesting, I don't know, saintliness or otherworldness.
Yeah.
Other questions? Comments?
George Hovis, do you have a question?
I do. First of all, thank you, Kevin, for sending me an advanced copy, which I enjoyed very much. Thank you, Bob, for writing this book of stories. I really loved it. I often read at night, and there were some nights I was so frightened I had to stop reading so I could go to sleep. So many of the stories are about men who venture into the mountains and then struggle for survival. And I wondered, I thought to myself, gee, this seems like a volume of stories written by someone who is writing a biography about Edgar Allan Poe. I thought the story Devil's Courthouse, especially in the premature burial, I'm wondering, was Poe an inspiration for some of these tales?
He certainly was. I was spending a lot of time reading him and writing about him. I am writing a biography of Poe, which will be published in November of this year. Yeah, Poe is one of the great inventors of the short story, the horror story, detective story, science fiction story. So if you write short stories, you can't not be influenced by him. Also, in my case, his descendant, H.P. Lovecraft, and those exciting stories high drama, always surprising you. Though often Lovecraft's stories are supernatural. And Poe knew that good science fiction could not be supernatural. It has to go from what is credible, realistic, seamlessly into the imagined. But yes, I think working on Poe probably had an influence. I alternated between working on the biography and writing fiction and poetry, back and forth, while an editor would be looking at the manuscripts. I'd be working on my own fiction and poetry. But I tried to get enough drama in there. I'm inspired by that kind of fiction, or was at that period. And when I was young, the kind of writers who really thrilled me, besides Poe, were Jack London, James Oliver Curwood, the stories about the Rocky Mountains or the Canadian Northwest. And I can remember when I was maybe 12 years old, I wanted to be a Mountie, a Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They were always having these great adventures in such wonderful places. That probably influenced me. The first story I ever wrote was written when I was in the 6th grade, and the class had gone off to the Biltmore House. Cost $3. I didn't have the $3. So I stayed back in the classroom, and my teacher said, "Why don't you write a short story? You love to read this Jack London and James Oliver Curwood stuff about the Northwest. I'll give you a plot. A man is lost in the Canadian Rockies. He doesn't have a gun or a knife. How did he survive?" And I spent the day writing that story. So my first story was an adventure story set in the wilderness. I guess I've kept writing those.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
I have a comment question, Rebecca.
Mhm.
So thank you for Kevin for sending me a copy as well. I've read the stories. I'm interested in the protagonist in the story, the secret face, the brave little boy who's not afraid of the corpse that he finds in the river. Just kept thinking of his sense of what he was looking at and what he was confronting. And I guess I wondered if there was a story in your childhood about a corpse in the river in the North Carolina mountains.
Well, there were stories about corpses in the lake, but this one is found. But
Okay, yeah, like
the
yeah,
real
right.
basis of that story is the fishing and the catching of the big fish. That actually happened to me. I was addicted to fishing at that time. And I guess it was the central idea was he's fishing, but he sees something white in the water. And he looks closer and is terrified, really. He sees this face. There's a face just under the water. And is it a living face? It seems to move a little bit. Its lips move, maybe in the ripple. So the first thing was fear. And then his discovery that he can't tell anybody. It's his secret. It's his fear. And what's going to happen to that? He has to preserve it. He wants to tell. He knows he should tell. But he's seen this body in the pool where he fishes. But he discovers that he can't tell. It's his private thing. It's his secret. He has this thing that he cannot reveal. And then, of course, there's the scary scene where the man in the Buick stops and asks him if he's seen anything unusual. And he's afraid of this man. He doesn't look like a kind person. And the man says, "If you was to tell, you would be sorry." So he knows there's more to this story. But yes, I wanted the surprise, the eeriness of seeing this, and then the surprise that he can't tell. He's got to keep this to himself. And I wanted to find out how that would turn out. The story is an act of discovery for the writer as much as for the reader. If you know exactly where it's going, it's probably not going to be as interesting as if you have to discover where it's going, where it has to go, as things unfold sentence by sentence. And it was something different. Yeah, I thought I would. The other stories are older characters. This is somebody younger. And I wanted to write about fishing because I was so obsessed with it at the age of 11 or 12. And I did catch a big German brown and took it home and ate it. And I always wanted to catch another one just like it, because we had this idea, if you catch one fish, there will be a mate with it. So there'll be two. I don't know if that's actually true, but that was the folklore at that time.
Robert, this is David Madden.
Mhm.
I want to thank you for the story you read, because all my long life, I've wanted to read a story about a naked intellectual. And that's the first line of my review for Phi Beta Kappa, I've decided. And I also, Kevin, want to use what you reminded him that he said about the short story being like snakes. I'm going to use that. I want to ask whether I'm right in cautioning the reader not to criticize your story aesthetically as being, as you're attributing to a man who's naked and terrified all of these intellectual ideas. But I found it totally convincing that a man that old, who has been that intellectual, that interested in so many things, who resembles somebody I'm looking at right now, that in such a situation, he wouldn't be thinking, I'm cold, I'm cold, I'm cold. He'd be thinking of all those ideas, all those insights that you reel off in the course of the story. I think that's rich. That richness is a great accomplishment.
Oh,
Does that sound close to what you hope that you intended to
no,
achieve?
absolutely.
Okay.
He's so miserable and so scared. He wants to think of something else. And think of Cabeza de Vaca, or the time he was refused a fellowship in graduate school. He has been this terrified almost before. But how would you react if you found yourself naked in the woods in a fog, in two kinds of fog, of course.
Well, you wouldn't react that way unless you were the kind of person you sketched, which, as I say, is a very complex intellectual sort of person. I don't think you're attributing to him things that he wasn't actually thinking, but a person could misread it that way. So I want to caution them in my review.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Well, we need to let Robert go. It's 6 o'clock. Bob, thanks a lot for spending your time with us today and sharing your stories and thoughts with us. This is a wonderful collection. I've put a link up in the chat if you want to purchase a copy. They're available now, and we're sending them immediately. We won't keep you waiting. But thank you all.
Thank you
coming
for
out.
arranging this, and all of you for tuning in. I appreciate it.
Yes, this was really nice. Feel free to unmute yourselves and give Robert a round of applause and gratitude. We'll send him off with a loud clap of thunder.
Yeah, Bob.
Oh, thank you.
Good job from North Carolina.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Appreciate you, Bob.
Thanks,
Bob.
Thanks from Salem, Virginia, Bob.
Thank you.
Thanks from Kings Mountain, North Carolina.
Yeah.
Thanks from
Thank you.
Asheville.
Thanks from Travelers Rest, South Carolina.
Fantastic. Thank you all so
Thanks
much.
for Black Mountain, where Mitchell, about a mile up the mountain, that opening of your story where Mitchell was killed.
We covered the state. Plus
Yep,
Virginia
sure
and
did.
South Carolina.
Sure did.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Well.
Bye, Bob.
Good night.
Bye-bye.